Pat Brown, I have a serious question for you that I think the entire world, not just the aeronautical world, I think the entire world is asking themselves, Pat Brown, why did you learn to fly?
Oh man, I don't know what I was expecting, but I was getting ready to wipe the smile off my face for a serious answer. Oh man,
It goes
you know,
back a ways, doesn't it?
yeah, it goes back to the years, more than I can count right now. Certainly not on my hands and fingers and toes and things. Um, this dates back to when I was a kid in Birmingham, Alabama, where I was born, and I can remember I, Jamie, do you remember back in the day, and some of our viewers I know will not. You remember back in the day when TV was black and white?
Oh, I remember it was little in black and
It
white.
was black and white, yeah,
There
yeah.
was none of these 63-inch screens.
Yeah, yeah, right, right. And not only that, the TV stations were there's only usually only one or two or three if you could even get those,
Yep.
and no cable. And and all of them went off the air somewhere between around 10 o'clock and midnight.
Yes, they
They were off
did.
the air and they had the test signal and all that kind of stuff. And again, half of our viewers probably don't have a clue as to what we're talking about. But and I don't know why I would have been up late like that at that age, but I can remember occasionally being so. And at the end of the broadcast day, before they put the test signal up, one of the stations a played a video with a poem called "High Flight" by Robert Gillespie. Oh, I have slipped the surly bonds of earth and danced the skies on laughter silvered wings. That one.
Yep, I remember.
I've always loved that poem. Um, but this one was different. It was a guy with this really deep baritone voice, um, and it was a starfighter jet doing barrel rolls and all kinds of stuff through towering cumulus clouds with this massive orchestra behind the voiceover. You can find it on YouTube. If you go and do a search for High Flight, you'll see several versions of it. But if you look for the one that's a really poor quality picture on the thumbnail with an F 10, I think it's a 104
Yep,
Starfighter.
F-104.
That's the one. I found it a few years ago, and I still look at it from time to time because all these years later, I've been flying for 54 years. It gives you an idea of how ancient I am. But all these years later, I see that and I hear that and I get goosebumps.
I
And
remember that same video. I was living in Connecticut then, not Alabama. I remember that same video because the F-104 has these tiny little stubby wings. It's basically an engine with
yeah,
some tiny little wings on it. And
yeah,
and I do remember that. And it was pretty exciting because I actually started out life. My dad was a fighter pilot for the US
right,
Air Force.
yeah,
So that sort of thing made a huge impression on me. And I can remember being 3 years old and in my parents' bedroom, and my dad was putting on the flight suit to go fly with the reserves. And that was the coolest thing in the whole world. And I never had a desire to fly military,
yeah,
but
yeah,
that whole thing of the preparation to go fly and, grabbing his bags and, later on when I'd get to go to the airport and walking out across the ramp, and that whole thing had a sort of a romance to it
yes.
that
That was
just
the exact
really,
word.
you got to be a part of this, man. You just got to be a part of
Yeah.
this.
And that is the exact word that came to my mind as well. It was the romance of just everything that surrounds an airplane. It was the coolest thing. So you came by it naturally.
Well, yeah, but the downside of my situation, and it wasn't a horrible thing, but my dad and everybody I knew who flew came through the military. And as you know, Pat, I was a long-haired hippie kid who played in a band. I
Yeah.
was, and I'm in that little sliver of time after Vietnam. I never even had to register for the draft. There was a very strong anti-military bent at that point, mid late 70s.
I remember.
So I just never even considered the military route. And none of those guys knew anything about how to learn to fly the civilian way. They
Right.
didn't do that. The airline pilots, they were all ex military at that point, or most of them. And I had no guidance. So really, I was in the same boat as everybody else. Now, I'm curious about when you made that transition later, but for me, I was in my 20s living in Greenwich Village, New York, playing in a band professionally. And I literally just wanted to get out of the city easier. I had family and friends out of state, and you've been to Manhattan. There's the train and the bus. That's it. And both of them involve long lines. And by the way, this was the 80s. So New York was kind of crime ridden. You didn't want to go to Port Authority. And I thought, I had no intention of doing it as a career. I was just learning to fly recreationally, be a private pilot and get out of the city. And man, it changed my whole life. I had no idea that could happen.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And look at you now.
Now, how did you make that transition from the little boy watching the F-104 on the little black and white TV with the vertical hold flipping up and get to the part where you're like, yeah, I'm going to get in a real airplane and do this?
Well, I'm barely old enough, really, and I'm being serious now for just a second. I'm barely old enough to remember the Mercury program and being herded into the all-purpose room in my grammar school to watch John Glenn and Alan Shepard being shot up into space, and thinking, "Oh man, that is really cool." Then fast forward, we moved to Michigan with my dad's job, and we had gone back down to Alabama to visit one summer. For some reason, we couldn't drive back home. We ended up having to fly, and we got tickets on a 707, and I was probably 14 years old, maybe not quite, and I was terrified, absolutely terrified because I'd never flown before, terrified. And the whatever airline it was we flew in originated in Birmingham. There was a stop in Atlanta, and then a flight to Detroit. By the time we got to Atlanta, I couldn't wait to go again. And so
That's
I,
so
like I said, I
cool.
was I was probably 14 years old, and that was probably that moment probably was what did it. And then if there was any question about that, some months later, my grandparents came up to visit, and my grandmother suffered a fall or something that rendered it impossible for her to ride in a car all the way back to Alabama. These were the days before there were interstates the entire distance. Again, we're talking a long
I
time ago.
recall two
Yeah.
lane roads.
Oh yeah, two-lane roads in a lot of it. So my parents chartered an airplane, a Cessna 206, flown by a corporate pilot friend of the family's, and he asked me if I wanted to go with him. And so I got to ride in the right seat from a little town in southern lower Michigan, just north of the Indiana border, down to Birmingham, Alabama, and back in the same day. And, for a drive that took 14 hours at the time, for us to be able to make it to Alabama, 700 and some odd miles, and back in the same day, it was like, whoa, this is just too cool. And that it was those two things that set the hook. And then when I was 15 and started working and saving money, and as soon as I was 16, I started taking lessons and soloed. Not too long after that, got my ticket shortly after my 17th birthday, and that was the start of it. It was awesome.
You know, I can relate to that completely because my first flight ever was on an Eastern Airlines aircraft, a Convair with round engines and propellers. And I remember just being glued to that window, watching those propellers go around for the whole flight. And I thought this was the coolest thing in the world. And yeah, jets were coming out by then, but we are old enough that there were still an awful lot of propeller driven
Oh
aircraft out
yeah.
there in the commercial fleet.
Oh yeah.
And it just excited me. And the other thing was I lived in Connecticut. I lived in East Hartford, Connecticut, the home of Pratt and Whitney.
Yeah.
And when I was a kid, they would test airplane engines by sticking them in an airplane and flying it. And Pratt and Whitney had its own airport, Rentschler Field, which is now a football stadium, I'm
Oh
sorry to say.
no. Oh no.
But we would hear sonic booms all the time. And I'd be a kid in school and the windows would rattle. And I'm like, that is so awesome. So, it plants the seed. And you've heard me say this before, but I don't think anybody ever wakes up in the morning and says, I got to become a pilot. I think it's a seed that gets planted at some point in your life. And maybe you're 4 and maybe you're 45. But
We were lucky, yeah. We were lucky in my little town of 7,500 people. We had an airport that's still there today. And in fact, for a high school reunion a few years ago, one of my bucket lists was always to fly my own airplane from here in Houston to my home airport where I soloed. And I did that a few years ago. But they also had a skydiving operation out there, and every weekend they would the skydivers would be out there, and my dad would pack us all in the car, and on a Sunday afternoon we go out and watch them parachute jump. So it was all of those things that were just kind of all tied in together, and it just became just a, I don't know if obsession is quite the right word, but it just became something like, I've got to be a part of this. This is just too cool.
I get that too. And I've had a similar experience. I flew last year, 2 years ago, back to Connecticut and landed at Brainerd Field, just outside Hartford along the river where I soloed.
Yeah.
And it was like going back to grade school. Everything seemed so small
Oh yeah.
and unimpressive.
Oh
And when
yeah.
I had started, it was like, oh my God, I'm at the airport.
I know.
But the big thing is, for all the struggles, for all the financial challenge, for all the study and the check rides and the nervousness, I am so glad I made this transition. And as you know, I loved being a musician. I loved that. It was great.
Yeah.
But this has really been something I never envisioned being any more than an occasional fun thing. And it just led to a career. And as you know, I became a pilot and a mechanic, and I write about aviation for General Aviation News and some AOPA publications. I do this with you.
Yeah.
This has just opened up an entire world of opportunity I never foresaw when I walked out on that ramp the first time and jumped into a PA 28 and took my first flight lesson.
This and working for AOPA has been a dream I never would have thought would come true, and it's been 8 years, 9 for you,
Yeah,
and
I'm starting my 10th year.
yeah, and thanks to AOPA and kind of being in that circle, I've met Bob Hoover, I've met Chuck Yeager,
Hmm.
I've met Harrison Ford, um, I've met Jim Lovell, I've met Fred Hayes of Apollo 13.
Apollo 13.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I've met Gene Kranz, flight director for Apollo 13. I've met Buzz Aldrin. I've met Gene Cernan. Gene Cernan has been in my airplane.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
I didn't know
And
that. Now,
oh, yeah.
now that's cool.
That is very cool. It's a long story. I won't bore you,
Last
but
man on the moon, Gene Cernan.
I know. I know. In fact, he would say the most recent man on the moon if he were still alive, not the last man. But because of AOPA and other things that kind of that led to, and that's just a short list of the aviation legends I've met. That I would not, none of this would have been possible if I didn't fly airplanes. I mean, we're talking about living legends.
That is absolutely true. And I, like you, I've been thrilled to work for AOPA for the last 9 years, going into my 10th. It's been fantastic.
Yeah.
But just being involved in aviation, I remember being at Sun and Fun many, many years ago here in Lakeland, Florida, second biggest aviation event in North America. And I was walking through one of the display buildings, and I come around the end and literally bump into Frank Borman, face to face, just boom. And I mean, he launched for the moon on my 10th birthday. I thought this was a birthday present to me. And, you're standing there talking to this guy, nicest guy in the world, and he just recently departed this planet. But this is the guy that commanded the first manned mission to leave Earth orbit, that people with slide rules said, yeah, if you go at this speed and get there and loop around the moon, you'll be able to come back.
Yeah.
I mean, smart, brave, talented as can be. And you're right. I mean, you get to meet all these remarkable people, not just aviators,
Yeah.
people from business and show business, like,
Oh,
like you
yeah.
say, Harrison Ford. There are a lot of people who fly you're not going to bump into at the mall, but you might at the airport and you might at the air show, and you have something in common to talk about.
Yeah, John and Martha King.
Darn
You know,
right.
I met them many, many times. In fact, when they fly from here to, well, from California to Florida and whatnot, they stop in Houston at the Black Walnut Cafe in Conroe. Yeah, I can't tell you the number of times I've run into them up there. Plus, obviously, at AOPA events at the various shows and things like that. Lovely people.
Well,
Um,
I'll give you a good example of how weird this can be and how small world it could be. I have a friend who's English, and she's a huge metal fan, specifically Iron Maiden.
oh yeah,
And she bought tickets to go to New York to go to a book signing for Bruce Dickinson, the singer of Iron Maiden.
right.
And she knows I was a musician years ago. And she came over to the house and she says, "What can I say? I'm going to be in line to get a book signed. What can I say to get him to have an actual conversation with me?" And I said,
Yeah.
"He's a pilot. Ask him if he's ever flown an air cam, because you and I have been flying in an air cam, and I guarantee you he will have a conversation with you." And sure enough, she got up there with the book and said, "Thank you. By the way, have you ever flown an air cam?" And his head popped right up and they got into a discussion. She was thrilled that aviation, which she's just dabbling around the corners, that opened up a conversation with her hero. It's an amazing thing. And it completely changes your life. I'm so glad I did this. And I'm absolutely sure you're having the same thought.
Well, as you know, I was in the music products industry, so we have that in common. And so as a result, I would, geez, over the years, I can't tell you the number of concerts that I had to go to because I was doing the artist relations thing. And Alex Lifeson, some of our viewers might recognize him as a guitar player for a semi-successful Canadian band called Rush. Alex is a pilot,
Oh, I didn't
and
know that.
yeah, flies a Cirrus,
Wow.
and and there's only so many times you can say, how's the tour going and where are you going to be next and how was the
Hmm.
last record and all that kind of stuff, and you got to find something more than that to talk to them about. Alex was into airplanes, so I mean, it's not like we were, warm, close personal buddies or anything like that, but there was at least something to talk about other than music, which is what he does for a living. So, finding something in common, like the Bruce Dickinson story, is awesome.
So let's bring this around to the average person where, you do meet great people in aviation, some famous, some not famous, but really interesting people. If you were talking to somebody who's 13, 15, 47 years old, who says, "I've been thinking about learning to fly, but I don't know, it's kind of expensive and, there's a lot of studying." What would you say to them?
Well, first of all, I would say yes, it's expensive, but some years ago I took made a comparison on what it cost me to learn how to fly when I was 16, 17 years old. And I basically asked Professor Google, what is the equivalent in 2000, whatever it was, $2020 or whatever the number was. And astoundingly enough, um, it's actually a little less expensive today. If you look at the amount I spent, it's actually a little less expensive today to learn how to fly. Now that's not true about buying an airplane.
Hmm.
That those costs have gone up, and not in a like manner, but to actually learn how to fly in real dollars, it's not that much more. In fact, it's less expensive today than it was, depending on where you go. So I would say yes, it's expensive, and you just have to understand it's going to cost you money. But if you play golf, it's going to cost you a lot of money for golf clubs. If you ride horses, it's going to cost you a lot of money to feed and house those horses. If you play tennis, it's going to cost you a lot of money to join a tennis club. If you have any kind of a hobby, if you sail boats or have a boat, I mean, boat is an acronym for bring on another thousand. I mean, it's going to cost money. So okay, so but you only live once. I mean, for crying out loud, you only live once. If that's something that anybody has been even entertaining, go book an introductory flight, or find someone who's a pilot and say, can we go for a ride? Or maybe you've got friends that are pilots. Bum a ride to them, to go to lunch with them someday, preferably $100 hamburger lunch. And
Yeah,
just,
and I can bring it back to my own life. As I said, I literally just wanted to learn to fly so I could get out of town quicker. That
yeah,
was a perfectly good reason for me. I was willing to spend the money to have that ability. I had no idea it would lead to an entire career and a lifestyle change. And, we have some mutual friends who are musicians, and I've, like you, been backstage with them after a show years after I left the music business. And they're like, really? You're a pilot?
yeah,
And it's kind of neat to have somebody who's just on stage in front of thousands of people who are cheering for him going, really? That's cool. I wish I could do that.
yeah. And you can.
Yeah. And it is that cool. And, as whether you want to be a pilot, a mechanic, an engineer, a writer, an air traffic controller, an administrator, a business owner, all of those things are available in aviation. So I really do tell people, if somebody's showing the slightest inkling that they think they want to do it, go down and sign up for a familiarization flight, a discovery flight. Take the controls with a flight instructor and actually experience what it is to fly an airplane, because it's like the difference between riding a bus and riding a racing motorcycle. There's no comparison. You get in that airplane and all of a sudden the world is three-dimensional: left, right, forward, back, up and down.
Yeah.
The view is fantastic and you're like, I want to go over there, or I want to go someplace that's 50 miles away. When we flew off to lunch, we're going to go someplace 50, 80, 100 miles away for lunch, and it's going to take less than an hour to get there. Okay, let's do that.
That's where I went to lunch today.
Pat, you cracked me up. Thanks so much. I appreciate you having this discussion, because so many people who want to get involved in aviation have no experience with aviation. They didn't have the benefit of that flight you or I had when we were kids. They don't know anybody involved in aviation. And maybe they don't know they're allowed to go to the local airport and
Yeah.
sit down beside the Coke machine and just watch some airplanes take off and land. And when somebody comes walking in to hit the restroom, you can say, hey, can I go peek at your airplane? And they're likely to say, sure, give me a minute. I'll go give you a tour.
Yeah, I'll tell you just real quick. As I was walking out to the airplane today from our $100 hamburger at the place where I took you, there was a little kid about probably about 5, maybe 6, with his grandparents, and they brought him out just to watch the airplanes, eat and watch the airplanes. And as I was walking out, he's looking at the airplane, and I said, "Well, you want to go look at it? I'll take you out." And the grandparents said, "Well, go, go." So he came out, and I put him in the pilot seat and all that kind of stuff. And I can't help think, because I give high school kids a lot of rides too around town that are in our high school aviation curriculum program, and I just can't help but wonder which one of them are going to be the first person on Mars.
Yep.
Every single time I take a young person up, I wonder, is this going to be the person that walks on Mars? And some people laugh at me when I say that, but something, Neil Armstrong was the first person to walk on the moon, and I'll bet you somebody gave him his first flight.
Well, it makes me think of, I met a Eastern Airlines pilot years ago. He had retired. He flew New York to Miami his entire career, but he started in DC threes and ended in 747s.
Yeah, it's astounding, isn't it?
It really is. So what's going to be flying around 30, 40 years from now? We have no
Have no
no idea,
idea.
but
But the
something's going to be
cool,
flying, and it's going to need pilots and mechanics and administrators and everything to make it work. So if you've got an interest in aviation, pursue it. See what you can do. Go down to the local airport. Most of them are municipally owned fields. Even a lot of private airports are open to the public. So
right?
check it out. But be sure before you do, you subscribe to the Mad Props channel, just so we can bring you more content like this. You click the like button, because Pat really gets excited when you do that. And if you would, share this video with your friends on social media, because they might want to know how cool you are that you're thinking about getting into aviation. So we'll see you next time. On behalf of Pat Brown, the coolest guy in the world who actually knows Alec Leifson and Ringo, I'll see you next time.
Adios.